What were the absolutely insane plans for George Lucas had he had his own sequel trilogy? Greetings acolytes and welcome back to the archives. The controversy surrounding the Disney sequel trilogy has only now just begun to die down within our own galaxy-faring community. Lots of behind the scenes details of what could have been in the sequels have come to light, showing us a very different way the story could have gone for Rey, Finn, and the rest of the cast. For many who prefer the Legends EU content, they believe that the truest iteration of the events post-Return of the Jedi occur in the Legends novels. But what if we were to tell you that both Disney and the EU content were actually tame, especially compared to the wild story that George Lucas had, one that he had prepared to tell for his own episodes 7, 8, and 9. The forbidden knowledge of what Lucas was going to do in his own sequels have been circulating for some time, but in today's video, we wanted to take a deep dive into Lucas's sequel trilogy and unlock all of the information that we currently know about it in a cohesive summary. Finally, we are going to give our own thoughts on this bold new direction for Star Wars. So what did the mad genius of George Lucas actually have planned for his story after Return of the Jedi? And could it have been just as polarizing as the current sequels? Well, there's only one way to find out. Let's open the Forbidden Holocron from an alternate timeline of the galaxy, which exists outside of either canon or Legends. Let us now enter the galaxy of George Lucas's sequel trilogy. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, the opening crawl would not have panned downward to show a scene in space as we are used to. Rather, this was white blips in a background that we think are stars, which are actually cellular organisms floating around in a microscopic void. The world of the midichlorians, the first and the most important thing to know about Lucas's plans for his sequels, where they were going to have an entirely different vibe and tone to them. Done extremely intentionally, as the tone between the prequels and the original trilogy is also vastly different. They tell their own unique stories. George Lucas went out of his way never to retread stories that he told before. He wanted to create something new and different with each trilogy, and the sequels were going to be told from a wholly unique perspective. That perspective was that of the Whills. The mysterious Whills are the most powerful beings in all of Star Wars lore according to Lucas, and we know precious little about them and their origins. However, George Lucas would have fully explored who they were and their role in the galaxy with his sequels. We will talk more in depth about the Whills towards the end of the video, as there's a lot to get into about them. But for now, what you need to know is that the Whills were tiny single-celled organisms that actually lived inside of midichlorians. The Whills fed off of force energy in return for providing power to their host bodies and expressing their will, forming a symbiotic relationship with all beings. The Whills were essentially the force itself. This is where we would view the events unfolding in the galaxy. One of George Lucas's major story beats was explaining what the Whills and the midichlorians actually were, along with their role and their power. Venturing back into the macroverse of the galaxy that we're familiar with, the timeline would pick up a couple years after the events of Return of the Jedi. The setup to our main conflict comes with the struggles of the Rebel Alliance forming into the New Republic, much like what we're seeing in canon, but with a lot more detail from Lucas. Specifically, Lucas wanted to focus on how the Alliance struggles to adapt from being a resistance cell to a formal body of government. Now that the war with the Empire was concluded, the rebels in the galaxy at large, they are very much in a now what situation, as Lucas put it directly. Meanwhile, the Imperial remnant isn't quite destroyed, but isn't used to what we're seeing in canon or Legends. The Imperial warlords are leftovers from the Moff Council. The remainder of the Empire only exists in what's left of the Stormtrooper Corps. With the galaxy no longer wanting them around, all of the leftover Stormtroopers were forced to retreat from the known galaxy, gathering together on a single planet. George Lucas calls this their own country, and a Stormtrooper rebellion, now insinuating that the relationship between the Alliance and the Empire have all done a 180 reverse direction. The remaining troopers are the rebellion, and the Alliance is the Empire. But what of our main characters? Lucas tells us that he had very different ideas for who was going to be the main character of his sequels. George said that he didn't want to fully move on to the next generation, and said that he had a specific someone in mind to fill the role of the hero. In his own words, the first trilogy was about the father, that being Anakin. The second trilogy was the son, Luke, and the third was going to be about the daughter, none other than Princess Leia herself. Lucas would also tease some vague ideas for a trilogy from 10 to 12, which likely would have involved the grandchildren of Anakin in their mid-20s. But with Leia as the star of the sequels, Lucas was actually playing with the idea that the Chosen One position was not a single person, but rather the Chosen One was a mantle that could be reincarnated. This hinted that the Jedi got the prophecy incorrect, and that Anakin may not have been the first Chosen One. And for Lucas, he would not be the last either, as in fact, Leia was the next Chosen One. Leia's story was going to be the main plot, revolving around the princess trying to get the now wild galaxy under control. As for Luke, Lucas implies that his adventures has been going to a B-plot story. And according to him, Luke sends out a memo across the galaxy calling all remaining Jedi survivors to a single location. Lucas says that about 50 to 100 Jedi remain following Order 66, down from the original loose number of 100,000 Jedi. Now again, in today's canon, we know that this has changed quite a bit, and that the number of Jedi alive during the Clone Wars was 10,000, not 100,000 according to Lucas. But all of this was of course Lucas's first draft of the entire sequel trilogy, not a second or a third. But anyway, Luke would also be going from place to place and location to location throughout the stars, finding 2 to 3-year-olds in order to train the next generation of the Jedi Order. So now we have 2 plots and 2 conflicts. The galaxy needing to be put back in order by Leia, and the Jedi Order being put back together by Luke. Of course though, it wouldn't be Star Wars without the dark side putting pressure on our heroes, and in comes the third and the final conflict of the sequel trilogy. Lucas doesn't go into much detail about the supposed Stormtrooper rebellion brewing on the other end of the galaxy, and this perhaps means that they come in mostly as minions to a new Dark Lord, or they were a problem for episodes 10 to 12 and the new generation, and was simply a simple seed planted here. But with the Empire gone, there was a massive power vacuum left behind politically. This would be filled by gangsters, crime lords, and Hutts, who all begin making power grabs. This is where one Dark Lord comes in, a Sith we are all familiar with, Darth Maul. By bringing Maul back in the Clone Wars, George was preparing to go all in, making an elderly Maul the main villain for a new age. He wouldn't do a lot of fighting personally according to Lucas though, and would take on the role as a new emperor, running a criminal syndicate as the main figurehead. As George explains, he would essentially become the godfather of the crime in the galaxy. The one coming against our heroes in a more physical way though, would be a brand new Sith apprentice. The one taking the new enforcer role that Vader filled would be Darth Talon. Darth Talon was a female Twi'lek Sith with red skin and black tattoos resembling the ones that Maul was adorned with. This was back in the days before Maul's tattoos were explained as a Dathomirian in origin and were actually traditional Sith warrior tattoos. This was Lucas's idea. George was a big fan of Talon's design in the Legacy comics and wanted to put her in canon with a new spotlight, but of course would change her role and origins. Instead of a servant of Darth Krayt from Legacy, she would be Maul's new apprentice. Lucas was also keen on keeping Maul's robotic legs, but he would go back and forth apparently between whether he wanted the cybernetic spider legs or to keep their design more humanoid. Bringing Maul back as the main antagonist was George's vision, wanting to tie up the saga by forming the perfect thematic bookend between the Phantom Menace and Episode 9. By the end of the trilogy, Luke would have gotten the Jedi Order back in full swing, and Leia would have successfully brought peace and order to the galaxy, becoming the new Supreme Chancellor of the New Republic. And although we have the ending, Lucas would keep how we got there extremely vague. He would also keep the events of a fourth trilogy vague. While we talked about doing something with the Skywalker grandchildren, this was not something that was certain after Episode 9, and Lucas was content with ending with a third trilogy. But back to the kicker, the perspective that it was going to be told from. Lucas really wanted to explain how the Force worked with all of life on a microscopic level, this being one of the main interests. Just as George Lucas enjoyed the politics from the prequels, this is something that many fans would not have liked at first, but likely could have grown on them if executed correctly. While we here at the Archives can do our best to explain exactly what George Lucas was trying to portray, we think that the holocron guardian of Grandmaster Lucas would speak on his own behalf and explain the wills perfectly. George said this: "There's this world of creatures that operate differently than we do. I call them the wills, and the wills are the ones who actually control the universe. The wills feed off of the Force. Back in the day, I used to say ultimately what this means if we're just cars, vehicles, for the Whills to travel around in. We're vessels for the Whills, and the conduit is the midichlorians. The midichlorians are the ones that communicate with the Whills. The Whills, in a general sense, they are the Force. The Whills are a microscopic single-celled life form like amoeba, fungi, and bacteria. There's something like 100,000 times more Whills than there are midichlorians, and there are about 10,000 times more midichlorians than there are human cells. The only microscopic entities that can go into the human cells are the midichlorians. They are born in the cells. The midichlorians provide the energy for human cells to split and to create life. The Whills are single-celled animals that feed on the Force. The more of the Force there is, the better off they are. They have a very intense symbiotic relationship with the midichlorians, and the midichlorians effectively work for the Whills. It is estimated that we have 100 trillion microbes in our body, and we are made up of 90% bacteria and 10% human cells. So who is in service to whom? I know that this is the kind of thing that fans go berserk over, because they say, we want the Force to be mysterious and magical, and you're just doing science. Well, this isn't just science to me. This is just as mythological as anything else in Star Wars is. It sounds more scientific, but it's all a fiction. It's saying that there is a big symbiotic relationship to create life, and to create the Force. But if you look at all the life forms in the universe, most of them are one-celled organisms. I think for a one-celled organism as an advanced form of life because they've been able to travel through the entirety of the universe. They have their own spaceships, those meteorites that we get every once in a while. They've been living on those things for thousands of years. They've been frozen, unfrozen, and can survive nearly anything. The one-celled organisms have to have a balance. You have to have good ones and bad ones, otherwise it will extinguish life. And if they go out of balance, the dark side takes over completely. Lucas essentially tells us here that the Whills act as the spokespeople for the Force, feeding on its energy and speaking their will through the midichlorians to a Force-sensitive host. Lucas also says that there are good and bad within the Whills, which explain the balance between the light and the dark sides of the Force. It sounds like to us that Lucas's sequels would attempt to explain this delicate dichotomy in detail as we've never seen before. Fully explain the Force, and it truly would have been a very different kind of Star Wars story than many expected. This trilogy would have been nothing like we've gotten anything in canon or Legends, especially with the part of the Whills. One thing has always been abundantly clear though, George Lucas's storytelling is always ahead of his time. But this story as well likely would have been polarizing, and fans clearly would have had major problems with it, specifically Anakin's Chosen One status being more of a mantle and a reincarnation rather than him personally. George Lucas seemingly wanted to tell a story of a more obscure novel than a mainline series of films. He even preemptively defended the Whills and the midichlorians as still being mystical despite the scientific language used to describe them. Before we ever got a single movie, Lucas was forced to defend his story. He also has stated that it wouldn't matter what the reception was, it all fit into his own vision and his own story. And in his mind, the sequels would have finally completed the story by explaining the Force and the Whills. George Lucas always wanted to flesh out the Force in the sequel trilogy. With all of that said, I think today's Star Wars fanbase would have been a lot more receptive to this idea than they would have been 10 years ago. The story still retains a Jedi versus Sith storyline, but by shaking it up in a unique new perspective and way, beyond even the events of the galaxy. For Lucas in the third trilogy, the Jedi and Sith are endangered species with neither one having the advantage at the time. A Luke and Leia versus a Maul and Talon winner-take-all storyline sounds phenomenal. This time the Jedi are experienced in how to properly deal with the dark side on the battlefield, and the Sith do not have massive resources. The Sith are scrappy, they are a hive of scum and villainy, and Maul would have been a very different villain than Palpatine ever was. For Lucas, the galaxy would have devolved into a wild, wild west, and Leia is doing her best job to pull it all together to restore balance amidst all of the chaos, just as her father did from another point of view. Where Anakin destroyed the Sith, Leia would unite the Jedi politically. During all of this though, we would have gained an introspective about the secrets of the Force from beings who control it. Lucas's story would have been insane, but certainly sounds extremely interesting, and far from boring. But that, my friends, is the story of what we know of George Lucas's sequel trilogy. Exploring the Whills and the midichlorians was something that he always wanted to do, despite whether fans wanted to see it or not. At the time, a lot of fans spoke out openly against George Lucas, not wanting his sequel trilogy. The idea of exploring microscopic organisms instead of Luke Skywalker was something that was off-putting to a large amount of fans. Of course, the dialogue now has completely changed, and many fans are far more interested in what Lucas would have given us. If anything, it would have been certainly unique. George Lucas is a phenomenal storyteller and a pioneer, and he went out of his way never to make the same film twice. But my friends, what are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on the outline of George Lucas's sequel trilogy from a first draft perspective? Again, I want to make it clear, this was also the first attempt that Lucas had, and he never got to go in detail, ironing out the little pieces of his story that he ultimately would have had we gotten these series of films. But my friends, do you think you would have preferred this to what we ultimately got from the Disney sequel trilogy? And what aspects of the story to you sound the most or the least compelling? If you enjoyed this different type of video and would like to see more like it, please let us know in the comments down below, and we'll attempt to produce more. As always, my friends, may the Force be with you in all of its forms, microscopic or not, and have a phenomenal day.